Hey there. So I'm coming at you one more time about the whole big women in ministry debate. It's again taken a huge life of its own in the last few days because Southern Baptist Convention is having a big discussion. One of their big leaders has proposed an amendment to ban women from pastoral ministry because that's what the scripture says, and so forth, so on and so forth. So I wanted to talk briefly about it because honestly, a lot of the discussion has been kind of bothering me and driving me a little bit nuts. The biggest argument against women in pastoral positions is Second Timothy chapter 2. So before I get to that, let me make a couple things clear. Scripture does not contradict itself. It doesn't. Ever. If you see what looks like a contradiction, something is missing. You're missing something, you're misunderstanding something, you're not seeing something there. Scripture does not contradict itself. So, what we run into here with the plain reading of First Timothy 3 in English is it creates a contradiction. That is because Paul in his other writings refers to Phoebe the deaconess. He refers to Lydia, who who has a church in her home, meaning she is the pastor. So you've got Lydia as a pastor, Phoebe is the deaconess, Junia, who is named among the apostles. Okay, the apostles outrank pastors, so let's be clear on that. Priscilla and Aquila. Traditional naming, you always name the husband first. They took prominence. However, Priscilla is repeatedly named first by Paul, in particular with the training of Apollos, who was an apostle and an evangelist. Priscilla is the one who took the lead in training Apollos. In the Old Testament, you've got multiple examples of women training and teaching men, including Huldah, who taught the high priests when they rediscovered the law, and Deborah, and so many others. The first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were women who then had to go tell the men. So there's this long list. Even Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 talks about when women prophesy in church. Well, prophecy at that time meant standing up and teaching. That's what prophecy was. It's not just future telling like we often forget. So you've got all these biblical examples of women teaching, training, preaching, pastoring, leading. And then you have First Timothy 3. I don't know why I keep saying Second Timothy. First Timothy 3, which then says, "Here's a trustworthy saying, if anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife." This is the hang-up. "The husband of but one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach." And the argument is, well, it's right there in plain English. The problem is, the Bible was not written in English. It is a translation. And people cannot seem to get past this. Well, what's it talking about then? So the problem here is the husband of one wife is actually a gender inclusive phrase. So the original Greek, if you were to properly render it, and this unfortunately has gotten stuck in translation and tradition since King James. Trustworthy saying, if anyone sets their heart on being an overseer, they desire a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, married to one spouse. That is a proper translation of the original intent and meaning of the Greek there, not what gets rendered. Now, is what is rendered in our English translations correct? Yes, in a literal sense, but not the intent and meaning of it. And this is something that we forget, is our translations attempt to take something written 2,000 years ago in different languages and different cultures, and then it's trying to transmit it and render it in a way that we can understand. And that's fine until the cultural understanding differs. So when Paul is writing to Timothy, he is writing to a specific cultural event, a specific time in history, and a specific situation. He was not writing to 21st century America. He wasn't writing to 18th century America. He wasn't writing to America at all. He was writing to Timothy in Ephesus. And in fact, when you look at the other passages that then talk about, I do not permit a woman to speak, and he talks about Adam and Eve and all of that, again, it's written into a specific culture and historical situation. And I actually had somebody, why do they always bring up history and context when they're losing? Actually, why do you ignore history and context when you see a contradiction? Because it's going to mess up what you want to believe. And this is the simple situation. You cannot sit there and say women cannot be pastors and have all these biblical examples of women as pastors and leaders. It doesn't work. It contradicts itself. And Scripture can't contradict itself. And invariably, the people, they weren't really pastors, or they were temporary. That's not what's here. That's trying to find excuses and write off what the Scripture says. So, how do you explain it? The only way to really understand and explain it is to dig into the history and the culture and find out what is Paul talking about. Now, I have to be honest, one of the best articles and explanations I've seen actually comes from Influence Magazine. This is published by the Assemblies of God, and you can actually find this article online. I'll try to post a link to it. But it talks in depth about the Ephesian world and the situation that Timothy was dealing with. The problem is he's dealing with these temples to Greek gods that lift women up above men, have a female-dominated culture, and they're not educated. And so these women are trying to dominate the culture, dominate the churches, because this is what they have come from, and they don't know what they're talking about. So Paul is basically saying, I'm not permitting these women to teach until they have submitted themselves to learn first. This is what's going on. And if you don't have that cultural situation, then you can't understand why Paul's referring to it there. And yet in his other letters, he's talking about all these women leaders. Paul's not sitting there losing his mind. He hasn't suddenly decided, you know what, all those women that were doing great jobs I commended and everything, no, they don't have any place. So this is really nice in explaining what is happening. So honestly, I would really encourage you to read this or some of the other background on Ephesus, because it's going to talk about what was going on. So, for example, Paul began addressing women in 1 Timothy 2:9. His remarks were a continuation of what he had already said to men. The Greek word translated, I also want, which means in the, husaros, means in the same way. He told the women to dress modestly and in decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Why? It's not because those are necessarily bad, but in Ephesus at the time, those were the marks of a temple prostitute. You don't want to look like a temple prostitute, don't dress like one. That's the whole point of what Paul is saying, is don't look like the pagans. And it goes on, here, let's see. So still speaking to women, Paul turned his attention to teaching and authority. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. It is important to note that the only imperative in these verses is a woman should learn. What Paul expected of women is a serious commitment to learning and discipleship. While the Greek word Paul used, hususia, can refer to silence, it is more accurately translated here as in a calm state. Paul used the same term in 2 Thessalonians 3:12 when telling disruptive people to settle down and engage in honest work. Okay. And it goes on and talks about what was happening and why Paul is explaining this. See, if you don't want to dig into the history and the culture and the original language, you're not going to understand what the scriptures are saying. When you want to ignore that, you're ignoring the intent. You're ignoring the context. And there's an old saying I learned that a scripture without a context is a pretext for a proof text. Basically, if you don't look at the context, it gives you an excuse to make that scripture mean whatever you want, however you want. And then it's used to justify horrible things like slavery or racism and anti-Semitism and so on and so forth, which obviously are not in the scriptures. I had somebody a little while ago say, well, we haven't paid attention to context in a long time. And that's the problem. You have to pay attention to the context. If you insist on ignoring the context, not just the obvious English, but the original context that Paul is writing to, his original intent, and the original language used, if you insist on ignoring that, then you are going to miss the point. And ultimately, that is what is happening in this entire debate about women in ministry and whether they can be pastors or teachers or leaders. It is insisting on ignoring the context because it's in plain English. But it's not in English. It's in Greek. To a situation by Jewish believers to Greek believers who have just come in from pagan worship. And if you don't understand that, you miss the point. Love to hear your feedback. I know I'm going to have some people disagree with me. The sad thing is I know I'm going to get some people who claim they're believers who are going to send very hateful things. Let me just say, if you can't comment without insults, labels, and hate-filled stuff, check your heart. Because God does say that if you don't love a brother, that it's... Sorry, John says, if you do not love the brother that you have seen, how can you claim to love Christ who you haven't? Check your heart. Anyways, this has been a little bit of a rant from me. Would love to hear your feedback. Thank you so much for watching. God bless.